All right, everyone, welcome to our webinar today. This is HITRUST 101. My name is Andrew and I work in marketing, and our presenter today is Trevor Hansen, and he holds the credentials of QSA, CISSP, CISA, and CCSFP. So we're looking forward to hearing from him today. As you can see on your screen, that you can see Trevor's picture there. He is the principal security analyst here at Security Metrics, and he has many years of experience now working with organizations, helping them to meet different compliance regulations, and now as a certified Common Security Framework practitioner, he is able to help organizations become HITRUST certified as well. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in here. Just one quick reminder, we will be sending out a recording of this presentation along with the slide deck. That's a question we get asked quite often. So stay tuned. Over the next couple of days, we'll be sending that recording to the email that you use to register for the webinar. So before I pass it off to Trevor, let's go through our agenda here. First, we'll be touching on an introduction to HITRUST. We'll also talk about why you should get HITRUST certified. And finally, we'll talk about how to get HITRUST certified. So first, what is HITRUST? I'll just do a brief intro here. HITRUST was founded in 2007 to support healthcare organizations in all sectors reach information risk management and compliance objectives. In fact, according to HITRUST, 81% of hospitals and health systems and 83% of health plans utilize the HITRUST CSF, and CSF meaning Common Security Framework. But since its founding, HITRUST has branched out and now are expanding to be industry agnostic. So let's talk about HITRUST goal for a minute. So the ultimate goal of HITRUST certification is for businesses to effectively manage data, information risk, and compliance. So HITRUST was created to provide an option for the healthcare sector to address information risk management using a matrix of third-party assessments. The idea is to consolidate efforts and reduce the need for multiple reports. So for example, the phrase we hear quite often regarding HITRUST is assess once, report many. So the HITRUST approach, along with HITRUST certification, gives vendors and covered entities a way to demonstrate compliance to HIPAA requirements and other authoritative sources based on a standardized framework. And then what does HITRUST cover? Well, you can see many of these security mandates: HIPAA, PCI-DSS, NIST, ISO 27701, and many other standards as well. So HITRUST does touch on a lot of these common, compliance mandates. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic off to Trevor, and Trevor's going to talk about the differences between HITRUST and some of these mandates, such as HIPAA and PCI. All right, thanks. I'll pass it off to Trevor.
So what's the difference between HITRUST and HIPAA? While HIPAA is a law created by lawyers and lawmakers, it's used to mandate the protection of privacy and health information. HITRUST is a framework created by security industry experts, not just the lawyers, and it includes aspects of HIPAA as well as other security standards and frameworks, puts them together in one place. The HITRUST CSF gives organizations a way to show evidence of compliance with HIPAA-mandated security controls, providing organizations with prescriptive security and privacy controls. HITRUST takes the requirements of HIPAA and builds on them, incorporating them into a framework based on security and risk. According to the HHS, the HIPAA privacy rule, so we got this straight from the HHS website, and it's some pretty heavy wording, so I'm just going to read it word for word here. The HIPAA privacy rule requires that covered entities apply appropriate administrative, technical, and physical safeguards to protect the privacy of protected health information in any form. This means that covered entities must implement reasonable safeguards to limit incidental and avoid prohibited uses and disclosures of PHI, including in connection with the disposal of such information. You're going to hear some of those words pop up again in a minute. So continuing HITRUST versus HIPAA. HITRUST can help provide measurable criteria and objectives for applying those appropriate administrative, technical, and physical safeguards. So where the HIPAA rule is really broad and says you've got to apply appropriate administrative, technical, and physical safeguards, HITRUST is going to help spell that out and give you more of a prescriptive response and what's appropriate and what can be used in those things. It's a better implementation of best practices, where HIPAA is just an overall rule that says follow best practices. HITRUST does not replace HIPAA compliance, and it doesn't prove that an entity is HIPAA compliant, but it's widely accepted as a good approach for evaluating risk and helping organizations understand how compliant they are. If you're HITRUST certified, does it mean that you're HIPAA compliant? No. But HITRUST is widely accepted as a good approach for evaluating risk. And as noted above, it doesn't replace HIPAA compliance, and it doesn't prove that an entity is HIPAA compliant, but it can help provide assurance. It can help provide risk management for people. So HITRUST versus PCI DSS. Many of you attending this webinar are familiar with security metrics, PCI DSS related services. We do assessments, we do vulnerability scans, things like that. HITRUST also incorporates the standards from the PCI DSS. It doesn't mean that being HITRUST certified will mean that you are compliant, and it doesn't mean you're compliant with PCI DSS, but you'll be well on your way down the path. The work that you do through a HITRUST certification process, if you're including PCI in it, it'll help you prepare for a PCI assessment. And if you use a PCI assessor to do your HITRUST assessment, there's a lot of things that they won't have to look at twice. They'll be able to look at it in that first assessment. HITRUST versus the ISO 27001 2005, and the 27002 2005, as well as HITRUST versus NIST. Again, getting the HighTrust CSF certification doesn't necessarily mean that your organization satisfies all aspects of those other security frameworks, but it does put you in a good place to get the combined risk management of these various strategies, and it helps you better evaluate your organization's capabilities. HITRUST focuses on risk and security, not just compliance. So you're not just there to check a box, you're not there to make sure that you're getting things done according to the rules, you're there to protect your data, and that's the focus of HITRUST. So certifying with HITRUST, it provides a clear message to your audience, to your customers, whoever you're sharing that certification with, that you're serious about security. So HITRUST certification basics. What is HITRUST CSF certification? Organizations that create, access, store, or exchange sensitive information can use the HITRUST CSF as a roadmap to data security and compliance. So again, this emphasizes sensitive information, not just healthcare information. While it was originally designed for that, it can be used for other things as well. You'll see that a lot of wording in HITRUST is definitely healthcare centric, but it can be applied to any sensitive data. The CSF is a certifiable, if you use a security assessor, it's a certifiable standard and was designed as a risk-based approach to organizational security, as opposed to a compliance-based approach. HITRUST CSF assurance program combines aspects from common security frameworks like ISO, NIST, PCI, those other things that we mentioned on the previous slide. Amongst the CSF's 19 reporting domains are 149 control specifications, which can be assessed to one of 3 implementation levels. In HITRUST, you're not just getting assessed, you're not just being evaluated on whether you're meeting a requirement or not, you're actually receiving a grade on each of those requirements. So they evaluate you based on these 3 implementation levels, and they can be, there's a lot of factors that go into which implementation levels you're targeting. And that's not going to be part of this discussion, but just understand that when you get a HITRUST assessment, you're looking for a passing grade. It's not everything needs to be pass or fail. You're looking for a certain score. So why would anybody care about getting HITRUST certified if it doesn't? It's not a HIPAA compliance certification. It's not a PCI certification. Why does anybody care about it? Well, it helps show your commitment to seriously follow security and compliance standards. It shows your commitment to follow HIPAA compliance. When HIPAA asks you to implement appropriate administrative technical, when it asks you to implement appropriate safeguards, HITRUST is going to help demonstrate that that's what you're doing. Many healthcare organizations, you guys will be familiar with this, but many healthcare organizations that are handling healthcare information, privacy information, they're going to require all their business associates, all those service providers that they use in PCI terms, they're going to require all of those to show that they are HIPAA compliant in some manner. They're going to need some level of assurance that you're being HIPAA compliant. So being HITRUST certified is a good way to help demonstrate that. This is because certifying with HITRUST provides a clear message that you're serious about security, about protecting sensitive data. As we previously mentioned, HITRUST also helps you to better save time and money when it comes to audits. If you have a qualified assessor from the different regulations, you can get there in one meeting and one assessment. The idea is to consolidate efforts and reduce the need for multiple assessments, multiple reports. So again, that term, assess once and report many. So HITRUST provides you with a good place to get the combined risk management of these various strategies, and it helps you better evaluate your organization's capabilities. Helps you put it all together in one place. For those organizations that have a dedicated security team or a dedicated compliance team, this could be a really good thing for you because it helps consolidate your efforts and it helps put it together in one place. So you don't have to say, well, we need a new server for HIPAA compliance, but we need this for PCI compliance, and we need this for something else. If you're validating against HITRUST, you can just put it all behind HITRUST and say that, this budget is there to help you become HITRUST certified. So who should get HITRUST certification? HITRUST is becoming more widely used and adapted as a regulatory standard. Since it incorporates and helps consolidate many different security and compliance regulations, it's becoming used across multiple industries. It's intended to be used to protect sensitive data, not just PHI or PII, but any sensitive data. If you want to know how you measure up to various standards placed in the context of protecting your sensitive data, HITRUST certification can provide an immense value. All right, so how to get HITRUST certification? What HITRUST calls the HITRUST approach provides organizations a comprehensive information risk management and compliance program. This blend of security and compliance mandates provides an integrated approach that ensures all programs are aligned, maintained, and comprehensively support an organization's information risk management and compliance objectives. HITRUST certification, to get the actual certification, you need an independent assessment or a third-party assessor. The only ones that can do these are HITRUST CSF assessors. So you'll see a certification next to someone's name, like a CCSFP. An organization that is authorized to do HITRUST assessments has to go through HITRUST training and HITRUST certification process and they have to have a HITRUST certified QA program in order to be able to meet all those requirements. So you can't just have any security company come in and do a HITRUST assessment. The length of the assessment depends on the size and complexity of your organization, the scope of your organization, and the amount of consulting that you require from the company to help prepare you for it. According to HITRUST, the certification process can take an additional 6 weeks after the assessment is complete in order to receive the certification itself. So just beware, it's going to take some time. And we'll talk a little more about that. When you're going to begin a HITRUST assessment, there are certain things that you should prioritize above others. And the first thing that you should do is you need to understand the scope. You're going to need to, I mean, you're probably familiar with doing this with PCI and with SOC assessments and other things, but you're going to need to identify your scope in order to understand what you're trying to protect, and that'll help you get an understanding of how you're protecting it. Part of the scoping activity that you do, just like you did for PCI, is going to involve creating, documenting, and reviewing how data or sensitive data enters your network. You're going to be concerned about the systems that data touches as it flows through your network and any point at which it might leave your network. For example, you're going to want to create network and data flow diagrams so you can map out that entire process. These are immensely helpful for you and for your assessor when it comes time for an assessment. So after you understand everywhere the data goes, after you understand all the systems it touches and how it interacts with each other, determine which type of HITRUST assessment that you're going to prepare for. You can either do a HITRUST self-assessment, which really means you're self-validating and you're just going to be attesting that you're following HITRUST, or you can get a validated assessment, so a third-party assessment, and your goal would be to get certification. Let's talk about self-assessment for a second. A self-assessment allows organizations to self-assess using the standard methodology, requirements, and tools provided under the CSF assurance program. HITRUST will then perform a limited validation on the results of the assessment. So HITRUST will grade your work, but it's a limited validation of those results, and they'll provide a limited level of assurance to the relying entity. The other side of that is if you do a validated assessment, it's conducted by a HITRUST CSF external assessor. The CSF assurance methodology is used and the controls are scored accordingly. Assessments meeting or exceeding the current CSF assurance scoring requirements for certification will be indicated as CSF certified on the report. And that's the end goal. That's what you should be striving to if you want to be able to fully demonstrate to other people that you've had a third party validate your HITRUST compliance. So to begin a HITRUST assessment, you are going to want to contact HITRUST. So as part of scoping your environment, after you've identified where your data goes, when you're ready to actually scope your HITRUST compliance itself, you're going to want to purchase access to the MyCSF portal from the HITRUST Alliance. It can be done by contacting HITRUST. There's a scoping exercise that you'll need to complete through their portal. It's going to ask you questions regarding your organization size, the number of applications that you're using for the sensitive data, the number of transactions that occur with this sensitive data, etc. Answering these questions is extremely important because it's going to directly affect which required statements in HITRUST are going to apply to you. So you can be doing a whole lot of work. If you answer this correctly, it might get you out of some of the things you need to follow. But if you answer it incorrectly, saying that you don't do certain things, and you later realize that you do, you're going to have to go back and revisit this scoping exercise, and it might expand your assessment out and make it longer. Because anytime you change the scope, it actually affects how many of those required statements, how many of those things you're required to follow. We highly recommend doing a gap assessment. You've probably done this the first time you ever did a third-party PCI assessment. You probably went through part of a gap assessment. You've probably seen it for some other things. For HITRUST, you're definitely going to want to do a gap assessment because HITRUST assessments, unlike some of the others, they don't allow for remediation, at least not in the way that you guys are used to. Once an assessor assigns a score to one of your requirements, that score is going to stick with it into the report. They allow for certain things to be fixed, but your report's going to show that those things were failing and you have a corrective action plan assigned to them. I mean, the scoring's kind of complicated. So the reality is just don't count on being able to remediate everything that you don't currently have in place. Your goal is to get everything in place that you can, and you want to get a certain passing score. So you should correct everything you can prior to the assessment in order to help you get that passing score. So before your assessment begins with the third-party assessor, you can engage with them and do some consulting and things, but before they actually come on site and do the assessment, you're going to want to remediate any gaps. When you discover risks through your gap assessment or third-party gap assessment, remember that it requires time and resources to address these issues. So, for example, some issues that might take some more time to properly implement, data encryption. If you realize that you haven't been encrypting your sensitive data as it's stored at rest, that's an issue that's not going to go away on its own. It's not, and it's going to take some time to resolve, and it's going to be high risk. Some other issues can be solved pretty quickly, like if you realize that a couple of your machines didn't have antivirus or it wasn't working properly, it's pretty easy to install antivirus or file integrity monitoring. A small shop can immediately reduce risk by doing things like fortifying firewall rules. So some items take a lot longer to remediate than others. Just keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that all implemented policies and procedures, everything that you're doing for HITRUST that you're trying to assess, this is extremely important. Everything that you're doing has to be in place 90 days prior to the before the assessor tests those things. That's one of the HITRUST requirements. It has to be in place for 90 days in order to be considered in place. So you can't just fix something and send it to the assessor right away and he looks at it and says, okay, that's good. You have to demonstrate that you've been doing it for 90 days. And that's one of the ways they help ensure that the requirements implemented as intended and it's permeated through the entire organization. So plan some time into the remediation process prior to the assessment. So a validated HITRUST assessment using a CSF assessor, the process usually can take anywhere from 4 to 10 weeks. The assessed entity, so you guys, would upload your evidence to the portal. You assign a score to it based on your own evaluation of your compliance to the required statement, and then you submit it to the assessor for review. The assessor is going to review your evidence, and he's either going to accept or reject your self-assigned score. So if you say that you have something managed and you have something documented, you have a policy on it, you have it implemented and it's managed, the assessor might review your evidence and say that that's not actually accurate. And he's going to review the evidence. He's either going to accept or reject it. And then due to the sheer number of required statements that apply to most entities, so the number of validation points that you're going to be submitting, you've got to expect it to take some time to work through the assessment, for you to submit those things to the assessor, for him to review them, for him to accept or reject them. HITRUST will also perform QA on the submission. So after the external assessor reviews your things, and when he finally has his score on those items, he's going to be able to submit it to HITRUST, and HITRUST is going to perform QA on that in the MyCSF portal. If the scores meet the minimum amount necessary, then the organization will become CSF certified. Otherwise, they'll just call it a validated assessment and you're not certified. Another thing to be aware of is when you get a HITRUST certification, it's valid for 2 years. That doesn't mean you're just done and you don't have to be compliant. You do need to maintain your compliance through those 2 years, and they do have you do an interim assessment at the 1 year mark. The interim assessment is going to be, it's kind of like a little mini assessment. If I remember right, HITRUST they actually select specific requirements that they're going to want the assessor to follow up on. And so they're going to tell him which requirements to assess you against, and they'll evaluate those things. And usually it has a lot to do with which items weren't having a fully passing score on the previous assessment. So there's going to be a lot of focus on verifying that you followed through with your corrective action plans and things like that. So an interim assessment occurs at the 1 year mark. The full certification assessment happens every 2 years. And both of those require a third-party assessor if you want to be certified. All right. So the takeaways from our HITRUST 101 discussion. So the intention of HITRUST is to consolidate multiple frameworks, multiple security, throw them all in one place, help you be able to assess once and report to many people, many customers. One of the most important things you can do before you get an assessment, as soon as you decide that you need to be HITRUST certified or that you want to be, you need to determine your scope. You need to evaluate what things you're trying to assess. You need to evaluate how data flows through them so you can understand what other collateral systems are involved in that scope. You need to, or it's highly recommended that you conduct a gap assessment. If you don't do a gap assessment, you're probably not going to be certified in the first time. So you can do if you're really familiar with HITRUST and you've spent a lot of time in it and other security standards, you can conduct the gap assessment on yourself. But if you use a HITRUST external assessor, you're going to get a more effective gap assessment, and they should be able to help you understand what it takes to get to a passing state before the assessment. As you do all these things, make sure to plan time for remediation. Some things, especially if you're just hoping that you accidentally became HITRUST compliant and you're just getting certified to see if you're there, plan a lot of time for remediation, because you're not going to be accidentally compliant to HITRUST or HIPAA or PCI. It takes a lot of effort to do these things. So plan time for remediation. And that's it for the presentation. Andrew's going to review the questions, and let's see if there's any that we need to answer.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll take just a minute to pause here and review some of the questions that came in. Then we'll be right back to answer those questions. Thanks. All right, so we are back. We've had some really good questions come in, so we'll get to as many of these as we can. The first question that came in, if I get a HITRUST audit, then I don't need to do a HIPAA audit. So Trevor. And also there was a second question that came in that's related to that. So I'll read that as well. You mentioned HITRUST does not imply that we are HIPAA compliant. What does certify HIPAA compliance?
Okay, great. Thank you. So if I get a HITRUST audit, do I need a HIPAA audit? And if HITRUST doesn't certify HIPAA, what does? So the HHS has been pretty forward about this, at least with assessing companies. They say that third-party organizations don't certify HIPAA compliance. We're specifically not allowed to use the word that you're certified for HIPAA compliance. The only people that can do that is the government. It's the HHS. So if you're getting a HIPAA audit according to their terms and being certified compliance, it's because you're in trouble, because you've had a breach or a complaint, and they're looking at you to evaluate whether or not you're compliant or not, so they can determine what fines to assess. So you can get assurance. Assurance is really, it's an industry term, but it's something Security Metrics likes to use for HIPAA. We can help assure other entities that you're HIPAA compliant. So we can evaluate things, and we can put our statements based on our evidence. We can put our opinion on your compliance, and we can represent it to other people. So you can do that through a HIPAA assessment from Security Metrics or another company. What it is they're providing assurance. They're helping other organizations understand if you're compliant or not. If you want an official certification, that only comes from the government, and it only comes after you've been in trouble for something, and if they can prove that you're not at fault. So that's why HITRUST doesn't mean HIPAA compliant. It doesn't mean HIPAA certification, but it does do a pretty good job of including most of the HIPAA requirements and throwing them all together. So it really depends on the audience that you have. If you're asking if you get a HITRUST audit, do you need to get a HIPAA audit? It depends on who's asking you for this information. If you're a business associate for other entities, and they want to know where you stand with HIPAA compliance, often they'll accept. You can ask them and say, is HITRUST good for you? Is HITRUST going to provide what you need, or do you want us to get somebody to look at just HIPAA? most of the time they're going to be happy to hear that you're willing to get a HITRUST assessment, because that'll help meet their needs, because you're really just trying to assure them that you're going to protect your data while you have it. So
Great.
I hope that answers the questions for you guys.
Great. Thanks, Trevor. Okay, the next question here coming in. So my business develops software for healthcare where we handle PHI, and also other industries where we do not handle PHI. So can HITRUST apply to a specific department or process within an organization, or does it need to be organization-wide?
All right, that's a very tough question, actually, because HITRUST, they do allow you to identify which kinds of flows, which things that you're evaluating. So you can be reporting to somebody else and saying, we are looking at this specific application, how it handles data, and you can talk about whether that application is HITRUST certified or not. The problem is that where a lot of people will have confusion is if those systems interact with other systems, if there's any chance of them being in the same environment of these other things, then you can't just carve it out and do an assessment against it, because there's too many things that impact each other. So if you have, multiple Amazon virtual private clouds, and you have this application under one cloud and you have everything else under other networks, then you could say that we're going to just assess this application. But if there's any chance, even if it's in the same network and they're segmented from each other, if they're in the same environment, same physical location, you're going to have a really hard time carving it out and doing just a HIPAA assessment against those things. It really needs to be air-gapped and completely organizationally independent.
Okay, so we've got time for a couple more questions here. One good question that just came in. Does the scope of the certification cover a specific time frame? Like the scope of a SOC Type 2 looks at the past 6 or 12 months. So for HITRUST, does it cover a specific time frame?
Yeah, I mean, you are looking at the last 12 months of things, but the most important time frame involved in that is those last 90 days. There are certain things that you're going to be doing throughout the year, and so you are going to validate against those things. But like I said, it needs to be able to show that everything was in place for the last 90 days at least.
Okay. All right. And then another good question here. Is there a roadmap you recommend to HITRUST, such as getting any preliminary standards in place prior to going for HITRUST?
That's a great question. I would say, when you're filling out the scoping requirements, or when you're filling out the scoping exercise on the MyCSF portal, it's going to ask you some questions about which regulatory compliances and other factors you want to include in your assessment. So let's say you do business in California. There are certain laws that affect privacy and healthcare in California specifically, or Rhode Island or New York. There are checkboxes that you can check on those things to say which ones you want included in your assessment. So if you're preparing for an assessment that has those California laws and HIPAA and PCI, then the best thing you can do is make yourself very familiar with those laws and those compliance regulations. So read over them, understand what they mean, because what HITRUST is going to do is it's going to take those and then put them together, and it's going to give you, in most cases, the more strict requirements. So if PCI asks for a 7-character password or greater, and one of the other regulations that you're trying to follow asks for a 10 password, then HITRUST is going to ask you to have a 10-character password. So read over them, be familiar with them. And at that point, that's when I would start engaging somebody to help do a gap, because they're going to look at it and they're going to help interpret those things for you and then tell you which ones to work on and how to get it done.
Okay. And then this question that came in, it's more of asking for a review on costs. So external costs comprise, number 1, access to my CSF. Number 2, paying security metrics for a gap assessment. Number 3, paying security metrics for certification. Is that correct? Maybe you could just review the external costs.
Yeah, I think we're missing one there, one of the more major ones. So you said that it covers access to my CSF. Yes, that's correct. So you have to pay for that. You're going to have to pay some of the money for the assessment goes to HITRUST itself. And I might be able to pull up some estimates for that. And then yes, correct. You're going to be looking at paying a third-party company for the gap and for the assessment itself as well. Give me just a moment. So somebody told me this morning that on average, the self-assessment reports from HITRUST, you're going to pay around $2,500 for a self-assessment report. Validated assessments will typically range from $3,700 to $1,200, and then whatever you're paying the assessor company. And keep in mind, it's quite a bit of work for these assessments. So for a larger organization, these assessments can run into $100,000 or more. So it's going to be probably more expensive than what you're used to for PCI because there's significantly more requirements you're going to be following. So yes, you're correct. Those are the costs you need to be aware of, but keep in mind there's also the cost. You are paying HITRUST for a portion of the assessment, and you're paying the assessor company for a portion of the assessment.
Okay, and also Trevor, on that note, do you have an estimate for the cost for a gap assessment for a business associate? That's entirely going to be dependent on your scope and how many systems you have. The same things that help affect the scope of the HITRUST assessment itself. So if you have multiple applications, your scope's going to go up, or your cost for a gap assessment is going to go up quite a bit. If you have one thing that you do, let's say you provide billing for doctors, so you do that one thing, and there's only one card flow, one process, not card flow, but one data flow, one process that you follow, then the gap assessment is going to be relatively simple and small. But yeah, you could talk with our sales department about that, and they can give you just a rough estimate or a more accurate estimate of what that would cost. Great. Okay, and let's wrap up here with one final question. Should all risk assessments provide a gap report? Or a gap analysis, I guess.
Okay, that's a good question. I think what you're meaning is maybe should all risk assessments have a gap report? Should you do a gap analysis before the risk assessment? Not in all cases. But basically a risk assessment is going to help determine what possibly could go wrong and what you're doing to address that. And a gap analysis is to identify failures to meet certain requirements. So the gap analysis is going to help. You're looking at where you should be, and the gap analysis is telling you how far you need to go to get there. The risk assessment is going to be identifying what could go wrong, what are the risks, how it's going to impact you. And according to the NIST risk assessment, you're going to be evaluating, you're going to be determining what kind of things you can do, whether you're going to defer the risk, or if you're going to mitigate the risk somehow, or if you're going to just accept the risk as it is. So I see those as two different things. But if I were going to do a risk assessment, I would probably have a gap analysis done if I felt like we're missing a lot of things, because the gap analysis will help you get some time to do remediation first.
Okay, well, great. Thank you so much, Trevor, for joining us today. And thank you to all of you for joining us on the webinar. We've had a lot of great questions come in. If you have additional questions that come up, feel free to shoot us an email, events@securitymetrics.com. You can reach us there, and we'll be happy to answer any additional questions you may have. Just a reminder, we'll be sending out a copy of the recording of this presentation, so stay tuned for that in the next couple of days. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at another webinar again in the future. Thanks.